She walked past him every single morning, past the man pushing a janitor's cart through the marble lobby, past the quiet figure wringing out a mop while executives in tailored suits swept by without a glance, past the man who, the night before, had held her in the dark and whispered that everything would be fine. Sienna Carradine, 30 years old, CEO of a billion-dollar company, walked past her own husband every morning and pretended he was nobody. And Callum Renford pushed his cart and let her do it. He let her do it because he loved her, because he understood the pressure she carried, because he told himself it was temporary. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when nobody is watching, and somebody was watching now. If this kind of story speaks to you, the ones about love hidden in plain sight, about pride and the price it charges, please subscribe to this channel and follow along to the very end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because some stories need to be heard beyond the place where they begin. Now let's go back to where this one started to unravel. The lobby of Carradine Dynamics was the kind of space designed to make people feel small. 60 feet of polished white marble stretched from the revolving doors to the elevator bank. The ceilings hung 3 stories above the reception desk, where a pair of assistants in coordinated gray blazers managed the arrival flow with the efficiency of air traffic controllers. Every surface reflected light, every surface was clean. That was in part because of Callum. He arrived at 4 in the morning, 6 days a week, when the building was empty enough that the sound of his cleaning cart's wheels echoed off the stone floors. He worked methodically, lobby first, then the service corridors, then the executive wing bathrooms before 7, because by 7:15 the first senior staff began filtering in and preferred not to encounter anyone from facilities. He had learned the rhythms of this building the way a surgeon learns a body. He knew which elevator doors stuck in cold weather, which executive was first to arrive and last to leave, which conference room always smelled faintly of cigarette smoke despite the strict no-smoking policy, because the man who booked it most frequently had a habit he'd been concealing for 11 years. Callum knew things. He always had. It was a skill, if that was the right word for something that had kept him alive in places most people never heard about. But that was a different life. This life was the lobby, the cart, and the 6:45 arrival of his wife. He heard the car before he saw her, the quiet purr of the company's black sedan pulling to the curb outside, the practiced click of the door, and then Sienna was moving through the revolving glass entrance in a charcoal blazer and heels she'd told him just 3 days ago, made her feet ache by noon. She carried a coffee she'd bought herself at the corner place 2 blocks away. Never from the company cafe, because the company cafe involved a 30-second wait and conversation she hadn't budgeted for. And she was already reading something on her phone before the door had finished rotating behind her. She was beautiful. She was exhausted in a way that lived behind her eyes and not on her face. She was exceptionally good at her job, and she was terrified, almost constantly, of the men who wanted to take it from her. She walked past him without a flicker of recognition. Callum continued mopping the section of floor between the security kiosks. One of the reception assistants, a young man named Derek, who Callum had always thought was basically decent, glanced over with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and apology. Derek knew about Callum, which was to say Derek knew exactly as much as Callum had allowed, that the janitor and the CEO had met through a mutual acquaintance, had some sort of history that neither of them discussed, and that the boss moved past the facilities staff each morning with the careful blindness of someone who had trained herself not to see something she desperately wanted to look at. Callum gave Derek a small nod. "Don't worry about it." Derek went back to his screens. The elevator doors slid shut behind Sienna. Callum wrung out the mop and moved to the next section. They had met 2 years ago at a school fundraiser. Callum had been there because his daughter Tessa, who was then 6 and already possessed of opinions so strong, she expressed them like policy announcements, had decided her class needed a new library, and had written a letter to the fundraising committee requesting that her father attend and help with lifting things and also being tall. The committee had found this letter charming enough to post it on the school's notice board, which Tessa took as vindication rather than amusement. Callum had spent most of that evening moving folding tables and restringing a banner that kept falling. He had been wearing jeans and an old gray Henley with a small bleach stain near the cuff that he'd noticed too late to change. He was not particularly interested in being there beyond the specific fact that Tessa had asked him to be. Sienna had been there because one of her company's junior marketing managers had organized the event and she'd been persuaded to make an appearance to generate goodwill and possibly a tax-deductible photo opportunity. She had arrived with a publicist and a prepared expression of enthusiastic community engagement. The prepared expression lasted about 14 minutes. Then she'd gotten into a serious debate with Tessa about whether libraries needed a dedicated section for books about marine biology specifically, or whether that fell under general science. And somewhere in that conversation, the publicist had drifted away, and Sienna had forgotten she was supposed to be performing. When Callum came back with a repaired banner and found his daughter cross-legged on the gymnasium floor, with a woman in a silk blouse and $300 shoes, both of them apparently drawing a map of the ocean, he had stopped walking. Sienna had looked up. Something happened in that moment that Callum, who was not a man given to dramatic descriptions of things, had never been able to explain adequately. He'd experienced danger. He'd experienced grief. He'd experienced the particular exhaustion of a man raising a child alone and loving every minute of it even when it dismantled him. He recognized significant things when they occurred. This was significant. They had talked for most of the rest of the evening, not about her company or his work or anything that required them to slot each other into categories. They talked about Tessa's marine biology convictions, about a restaurant 3 blocks from the school that apparently made the city's best soup dumplings, about what it meant to do work you believed in versus work that paid the rent. She asked what he did. He said he was between things currently, doing some facility work while he figured out next steps. Which was true, in the way that most things Callum said were true, accurate on the surface and considerably more complicated underneath. She hadn't pressed. He liked that. He found her number 3 days later through a degree of effort he chose not to examine too carefully. He texted her. She replied within 4 minutes, which told him something, and asked about the soup dumplings, which told him more. They dated for 5 months. They were careful about it, Sienna, because she was always careful about anything that intersected with her professional life, and Callum, because caution was simply how he was wired. Tessa met Sienna on a Sunday afternoon at a botanical garden and spent 40 minutes quizzing her about sea turtles before announcing, with the authority of someone who had voted and expected her vote to count, that Sienna could come back. Callum had applied for the position at Carradine Dynamics Facilities because it was straightforward work that left his mind quiet enough to be present for Tessa. He had not told Sienna he was applying. He had not done it to be near her. Or not only for that reason. He'd done it because the overnight shift paid better than the day shift at the place he'd been working, and because Tessa's after-school care was costing more than he'd anticipated, and because sometimes the economics of a situation are what they are. He told Sienna after he'd gotten the position. She had gone quiet for a moment. Then she had said, carefully, that it might be complicated, that people at the company would form opinions. He said he understood. He understood more than she knew. He understood that she was weighing something and that the scales weren't just about them. They got married 4 months later at the county clerk's office. Tessa wore a yellow dress she'd picked herself and carried a small bunch of wildflowers and stood between them with her hand in Callum's and beamed at the clerk like the whole proceeding had been her idea from the start. Sienna cried a little, which she would later claim was allergies, and which Callum and Tessa would exchange a look about for the rest of their lives. And then they agreed together that they would keep it quiet for now, just until the right moment, just until things settled. That was 18 months ago. The right moment had not arrived. He noticed the SUV for the first time on a Thursday, not because it was particularly conspicuous. It was a black Chevrolet, commercial plates, one of 1,000 identical vehicles in Manhattan, but because it was parked in the same position on the street outside their apartment 2 evenings in a row, and the engine was running both times, and the windows were the kind of tinted that crossed the legal line in New York State. Callum processed this information quietly, the way he processed most things. He didn't mention it to Sienna that first night, but he stood at the kitchen window after she fell asleep and watched the SUV for 45 minutes until it finally pulled away. He knew what it was like to be surveilled. He also knew what it was like to be the person doing the surveilling and the specific discipline it required to hold a position for hours without revealing yourself. Whoever was in that vehicle was patient and professional, which narrowed certain categories of possibility and expanded others in ways he didn't love. He said nothing to Sienna in the morning because she left early, as she always did, and because he needed more information before he said anything at all. He did not say nothing because he was afraid. The evening before he noticed the SUV, something else had already happened. Something that had been building for weeks and had finally found its shape. It had started in the lobby, as so many things in their life seemed to start now. Bradley Harmon, one of Carradine Dynamics' senior vice presidents, had been waiting for an elevator when his leather portfolio had slipped from under his arm and scattered. Reports, contracts, a printed boarding pass for a Friday flight, across the lobby floor. Callum had been nearest. He'd moved instinctively, crouching to gather the papers before they skittered further. Harmon had taken the papers from him without acknowledgement. The elevator doors had opened. Harmon had stepped in. Then, as the doors were closing, he had looked back at Callum with an expression of mild contempt and said, to no one in particular, "They really should train these people better." The doors closed. Sienna had been 4 feet away, waiting for the next elevator. She'd heard it. Callum had looked at her. She had looked at the elevator doors. She had said nothing. He had stood up and gone back to his cart and said nothing either. Not then. But that evening, after Tessa was in bed and they were sitting at the kitchen table with tea neither of them was drinking, he had set down his mug and looked at his wife. "What would it have cost you," he said, "to say something?" Sienna turned the mug in her hands. "Callum, I'm not asking about the marriage. I know why we're keeping that quiet. I'm asking about being a person. What would it have cost you to say, actually, this man is helping you, so maybe don't do that?" It would have drawn attention. To what? She was quiet. To the fact that you know me. He said it evenly. Not as an accusation, almost as a question he was genuinely trying to understand. It's more complicated than that. Is it? You know it is, Callum. You know what Blaine and the others are looking for. Any reason to say I'm not serious? Any reason to say my judgment is off? He nodded. Right. That's not... She stopped. Started again. I'm not saying you're the problem. What are you saying? She didn't have an answer that satisfied either of them, and they both knew it. Sienna pressed her mouth together and stared at the table. Callum looked at the window. Eventually he said, "Are you protecting our marriage or hiding me?" She looked up. "Because those are different things," he said, "and the difference matters to me." She didn't answer, not that night, and they went to bed with the question sitting between them like an object they'd both agreed to step around. 3 nights after the Harmon incident, Callum came home from his shift at 2 in the morning and found Tessa's bedroom light still on. He knocked, pushed the door open. She was in bed with a book propped on her knees, a library book about the migratory patterns of loggerhead sea turtles, which she had checked out and renewed 4 times now. And she looked up at him with the particular expression of a child who has decided that she was absolutely already falling asleep, and you just caught the very end of it. "Tess, I was almost done with the chapter. You've been almost done with the chapter every night this week. It's a very long chapter." She held the book up. "Look at it." He sat on the edge of her bed and took the book gently from her hands and placed it on the nightstand. She watched him with those steady dark eyes she'd inherited from her mother, and then she said, in the tone she used when she had decided something was important enough to say directly, "Is Sienna okay?" Callum looked at her. "Why do you ask?" She seemed worried the last time she came over, like she was thinking about something else the whole time but didn't want to say what it was. He chose his words carefully. "She's dealing with some hard things at work." "Is it the people who are mean to her?" He paused. "What do you know about that?" Tessa shrugged with the studied casualness of a child who has overheard more than she has let on. "I know some people at her company don't think she should be the boss. Because she's young and because she's a woman, which is dumb." She considered. "And I know she worries about what people think, which is also dumb, but I understand it because some kids at school are like that too." Callum sat with that for a moment. "Dad," Tessa said. "Yeah, Bug. You're not going to let anything bad happen to her, right?" He looked at his daughter, 8 years old, enormous-eyed, already half in love with the sea turtles, and entirely capable of carrying the weight of what she was actually asking him. "No," he said. "I'm not." She nodded, satisfied in the way she became satisfied when something was settled, and pulled her blanket up to her chin. He kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp. On his way out, he paused in the hallway and looked back toward the dark window at the end of the corridor. The street below was quiet, but when he moved to check the angle he'd learned to check, the black SUV was there again. Same position. Engine running, windows dark. He stood there for a long moment, not moving. He had not told Sienna about the vehicle. He had not told her about the two men he'd noticed in the building's parking structure last week, who had no business being there and had clocked his presence in the peripheral professional way that told him they were not amateurs. He had not told her because he was still measuring, still determining whether what he was seeing was what he thought it was. But the accumulation of evidence was making that question harder to avoid. Callum went to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and stood at the window with it. The SUV finally moved at 3:14 in the morning. He watched it go. Then he went to the drawer beside the refrigerator where most people kept takeout menus and rubber bands, and he opened it, and at the very back, beneath a folder of Tessa's old-school drawings, was a phone he had not turned on in 2 years. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put it back. Not yet. But the word had shifted in his mind. It was no longer a question. It was a countdown. The phone he'd buried at the back of the drawer stayed there. For 4 days, Callum went to work, mopped floors, emptied wastebaskets, replaced burned-out bulbs in hallways that nobody used after 7 in the evening. He watched the building the way he always watched things, not with the theatrical alertness of someone who expected trouble, but with the quiet, patient attention of a man who had learned, over years and in circumstances he didn't discuss, that the difference between seeing a threat and missing one was usually not intelligence or training, but simply the willingness to pay attention when nothing appeared to be happening. He noticed things. He noticed that the parking structure had a new attendant, a heavy-set man in his late 30s who had started 3 weeks ago and who, despite being stationed at the entry booth, spent a disproportionate amount of time walking the interior levels for reasons the job did not require. He noticed that one of the cameras on the executive floor had been repositioned slightly, the angle adjusted by perhaps 15 degrees, which was not something facilities had been asked to do and which was not in the maintenance log. He noticed that a white panel van had joined the black SUV in the rotation outside their apartment building, alternating nights, never quite close enough to be obvious, but never far enough away to be incidental. He said nothing to Sienna. This was not, he recognized, a decision he could sustain indefinitely. But he was still building a picture, and incomplete pictures led to incomplete responses, and incomplete responses in his experience led to outcomes that were difficult to recover from. So he watched, and he cataloged, and he kept his face neutral when he passed the new parking attendant each morning, and he told himself he was being methodical rather than afraid. The truth was somewhere between the two. On the 5th morning, Blaine Torek called an executive meeting. Callum knew about it the way he knew about most things in the building, not through any particular access to information, but because the executive floor had a rhythm, and disruptions to that rhythm were legible if you knew how to read them. The assistants moved differently. The conference room adjacent to Sienna's office had been booked under a security clearance designation that was only used for sensitive internal matters. The catering order that came up on the service elevator at 8:15 was for 12 people, which was 4 more than the standard Thursday morning check-in. He was on the executive floor at 9, replacing a faulty light fixture in the east corridor. Legitimate work, scheduled 3 days prior. When the meeting room door opened and voices spilled into the hallway, Blaine Torek's voice was the kind that carried even when its owner intended restraint, which Torek rarely did. He was 51, silver-haired, and had the physical confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in the rooms he entered. He had been at Carradine Dynamics for 11 years, had expected to be appointed CEO when the previous director retired, and had not been. Sienna had been appointed instead. Callum had worked out these facts in his first 2 weeks at the company because they explained the particular texture of the hostility that filled certain rooms when her name came up. The documents were logged out at 11:47 p.m., Torek was saying. The security system shows one access badge active on the floor at that time. Facilities. Callum continued working on the fixture. He did not move faster. He did not slow down. Which member of facilities? Someone asked. We're cross-referencing now, but the overnight cleaning crew is a short list. There were 4 people on the overnight cleaning crew. Callum was one of them. He replaced the fixture cover, gathered his tools, and moved his cart toward the elevator. As he passed the open conference room door, he caught a brief fragment of what followed. Torik's voice saying something about restricted access and pattern of behavior. And then the door swung mostly shut and he was past it, and the elevator arrived and he stepped in. He rode down to the second floor, walked to the supply closet, sat down on an overturned bucket, and thought. He had been on the executive floor at 11:47 p.m. 6 nights ago. That was documented. What was not documented, what existed nowhere in any system, was why. He had gone up because he had noticed, from the building's exterior, two figures moving on the executive floor at an hour when nobody should have been there. He had gone up to look. He had found the floor empty, which told him the figures had come and gone, and he had come back down. He had not filed a report because filing a report would have required explaining what he was doing watching the building's exterior at midnight, which would have required an explanation he was not prepared to give. So the security footage showed the janitor on a floor he had no business being on, and showed nothing else. And that was a problem. Sienna found out about the meeting at 10:15 when her assistant placed a printed summary on her desk with an expression that communicated, without words, that this was the kind of document that required more than a glance. She read it standing up. The language was careful. Torik was not stupid enough to put accusations in print, but the implication was clear. The acquisition documents for a potential merger with a tech logistics company had disappeared from the secure server. They'd been accessed after hours. The overnight janitor's badge was the only active credential on that floor during the window. She sat down. Her first thought, and she would never say this aloud, not to anyone, was not about Callum. Her first thought was about the board, about what Torik would do with this, about how it would look. Her second thought, arriving approximately 4 seconds later and carrying considerably more force, was shame. She picked up the phone and called facilities. The meeting Torik called was not the small security review that the printed summary implied. By 11 a.m., it had expanded to include 4 senior vice presidents, the head of legal, and 2 members of the board who happened to be in the building. Torik had managed this expansion with the efficiency of a man who had been planning it for longer than the last 12 hours. Sienna walked in as Torik was mid-sentence. Pattern of unauthorized access suggests either negligence in our vetting process or something more deliberate, and either way, the liability. I'd like to hear what the employee in question has to say, Sienna said. The room went quiet, not the respectful quiet of people deferring to leadership, the uncomfortable quiet of people recalibrating. Torik turned to look at her. Sienna, we weren't expecting you until, it's my company, Blaine, revise your expectations. She set her folder on the table and sat down at the head of it, which was where she always sat, and where, she had noticed, certain people always seemed faintly surprised to find her. Has anyone actually spoken to Callum Renford? A pause. Someone shuffled papers. The employee hasn't been formally interviewed yet, the head of legal said. We were establishing the parameters of the investigation first. So we've had a meeting about him, in front of the board, before we've spoken to him. Another pause. Slightly longer. That's, Torik began. Bring him up, Sienna said. She watched Torik's face process this, weigh it, decide it was acceptable because he was confident in his position. He nodded to the assistant by the door. Callum arrived 12 minutes later. He had taken off his work gloves. He had not changed his clothes. He walked into the conference room in his gray facilities uniform and looked at the assembled faces without particular alarm, which Sienna could see disconcerted Torik slightly. People in Callum's position usually came into rooms like this scared, and scared people were easier to manage. Thank you for coming up, Sienna said. Of course. He looked at her. Just a look. Brief, professional, revealing nothing. But she felt it like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. Mr. Renford, Torik said, moving into the space before Sienna could continue. Our security logs place your badge on the 31st floor last Wednesday at 11:47 p.m. Can you explain what you were doing there? Callum looked at Torik. Checking the floor. Checking it for what? A beat. I'd noticed some light activity through the exterior windows while I was on break. I wanted to make sure there wasn't a maintenance issue. You were on break outside the building at midnight? Sometimes I get some air. That's not in any facilities protocol. No, Callum agreed. It's not. Torek let the silence sit, the way people do when they want a room to feel that silence as an admission. And you didn't report what you observed, or file a maintenance ticket. There was nothing there when I arrived, no issue to report. Convenient. The word landed like something thrown across a table. Sienna felt the room shift. I'd push back on that characterization, she said. Torek turned to her. Sienna, I understand you want to be thorough, but the security evidence shows an employee doing what he said he did, going to a floor to check on something. It doesn't show him touching a server, removing a file, or doing anything at all except existing on that floor for... She glanced at the report. 11 minutes. 11 minutes is enough time to access a server and copy documents. It's also enough time to walk a corridor and decide there's nothing wrong and leave. Blaine. She said his name flatly. Has it occurred to you that whoever actually took those documents might benefit from this conversation happening exactly as it's currently happening? Torek's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. That's speculative, he said. Most accusations are, before there's evidence. She looked back at Callum. Thank you, Mr. Renford. We'll be in touch if there's anything further. He nodded once, stood, left. The door closed behind him. Torek looked at her across the length of the table and said, very quietly, You're making a mistake. I make them occasionally, Sienna said. Let me know when you find the documents. The elevator ride down was 40 seconds. Callum spent 37 of them staring at the floor indicator. She had defended him, partially. She had pushed back on Torek and bought him room, and he was not ungrateful for that. But he had also watched her make the calculation in real time, the brief hesitation before she spoke, the careful way she'd framed her defense around the absence of evidence, rather than any assertion of his character. She had not said, I know this man and this accusation is wrong. She had said, the evidence doesn't support the conclusion. Both of those statements were true. Only one of them would have cost her something. He walked back to the supply closet, sat down again on the overturned bucket, and pressed his hands against his knees. He was not angry in the way that makes noise. He was angry in the way that sits still and takes inventory. What he was taking inventory of, specifically, was everything he had not told Sienna. The SUV, the panel van, the repositioned camera, the parking attendant who wasn't doing his job, the general shape of a surveillance operation that was organized and patient and pointed in a direction he had been trying not to look at directly. He looked at it now. The men in that parking structure had used a particular hand signal when they'd clocked him, a small practice gesture, almost too quick to catch. He had not registered it consciously in the moment, but it had settled into memory the way things always did, and in the days since it had surfaced when he was trying to sleep. He knew that gesture. He had used it himself once. It was not a security contractor's signal. It was not law enforcement. It was older than either and associated with a specific operational style that he had encountered in circumstances he had spent 2 years trying to put behind him. He pulled out his personal phone and opened his contacts, scrolled to a name he hadn't called in 18 months, Decker, M. Marcus. Decker had been his team's intelligence coordinator during the last 2 years of Callum's operational career. He was thorough, methodical, and possessed of the particular kind of institutional memory that made him useful long after official channels had closed. He had also, when they last spoke, been doing private security consulting from an office in Northern Virginia. Callum typed, Need a name check. Not urgent. Actually urgent. Can you call? He sent it. Then he sat in the supply closet for another 2 minutes, because sometimes you needed 2 minutes before you went back to being the man pushing the cart. Decker called at 4:17 p.m., while Callum was cleaning the 6th floor bathrooms. Well, Decker said, without preamble, I was wondering how long before I heard from you. What does that mean? A pause. What name are you checking? Callum stepped into the hallway, glanced both directions, and moved to the far end where the window overlooked the service alley. Rourke Vesper. The silence on the other end was 3 seconds long, which was not a long silence in ordinary terms, but was significant coming from Marcus Decker, who processed information faster than most people formed sentences. Where did that name come from? Decker said finally. That's what I'm trying to determine. Is he active? Yes. Another pause. I've been watching some chatter for the past 6 weeks that suggested a reorganization. I didn't have a geographic anchor until right now. Callum leaned against the window frame. Outside in the service alley below, a white panel van was parked at the far end, nose out. The organization collapsed, Callum said. After Kandahar, the public part collapsed. The leadership scattered. Some of them rebuilt. Decker's voice had flattened into the register he used when he was being precise rather than conversational. Rourke Vesper was extradited to European custody in 2019. He was released 14 months ago on a procedural appeal. The charges were refiled, but the process takes time, and time is exactly what men like him are good at using. Callum watched the van. He knows where I am. If that's true, then yes. And Callum. Decker stopped. If he's come for you directly, it won't be for you. He already knew that. He had known it the moment he'd recognized the hand signal in the parking structure. Rourke Vesper was a man of specific grudges and specific methods, and his methods did not involve going directly at a target if the target's vulnerabilities were available and easier to reach. Callum's vulnerabilities were two people, one 8 years old, one 30. I need to move Tessa, he said. Agreed. Do it tonight. Don't use your car. Decker paused. What about the woman? Callum didn't answer immediately. There's a corporate event, he said. 3 days. I need her to cancel it. Can you make her? He thought about Sienna, about the conversation at the kitchen table, about the way she'd looked at the elevator doors. I don't know, he said honestly. Then you'd better figure it out fast. And Callum, Decker's voice shifted slightly. Whatever you haven't told her, you need to tell her. All of it. The call ended. Callum stood at the window and looked at the van for a long moment. Then he went to find Sienna. He caught her in the parking structure at 6:15 as she was heading to her car. He'd timed it because the structure had a dead zone in the camera coverage on level 2. Not a flaw, but a feature from the building's original design, which he'd identified in his first week. He had waited for her there. She stopped when she saw him. Her driver was 20 feet away, out of earshot. Callum, her voice was careful. This isn't a good... I know. I need 3 minutes. He moved close enough that he wasn't projecting his voice. The company gala on Saturday. I need you to cancel it. She stared at him. Cancel it. The gala that 300 people are attending, the one we've had on the calendar for 6 months. Yes. Callum, I can't cancel. There are people watching this building, he said. There's been a surveillance rotation on our apartment for over a week. The camera on your executive floor was repositioned by someone who wasn't facilities. And the parking attendant who started last month is not actually a parking attendant. She went very still. I know some of this sounds like you've been watching everything and telling me nothing, she said. Her voice had changed, not to anger exactly, to something colder. I was building a picture. For a week. Yes. While this was happening to both of us. He held her gaze. I know. That's what you do? You just decide how much I'm allowed to know and when I get to know it. I was trying to protect. Don't. She said it quietly, which was worse than if she'd been loud. Don't say that. Don't tell me you were protecting me from information about a threat to my own life. He was quiet. You had a whole life before me, she said. A whole history. People who wanted something from you badly enough to follow us home and infiltrate my building, and you just decided I didn't need to know that until you'd figured it out. She pressed her hand flat against her forehead. How long were you going to wait? Until I had something concrete to give you. This is concrete. This right here is concrete, Callum. I know. I'm telling you now. She looked at him. Actually looked at him, the way she did sometimes when she was trying to find the boundary between what he said and what he meant. He let her look. Who are they? She asked. He told her. Not everything. Not all of Kandahar. Not the operational details that would take hours to explain and would only frighten her further without adding anything useful. But the essential shape? Rourke Vesper. The organization. The rescue operation that had been Callum's last major deployment. The exposure that had brought it down. And the man who had every reason to consider Callum personally responsible. Sienna listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for several seconds. The gala, she said. If you're in a controlled public environment with 300 people, if I cancel, the board will want a reason. Torek will call it instability. The merger talks we've been building toward for 4 months will stall. Sienna. I know, she said sharply. I know what you're telling me. I'm not dismissing it. I'm telling you what canceling costs. He looked at her. I understand the cost. I'm asking you to pay it anyway. Her jaw tightened. She looked away from him, toward the exit of the parking structure, where the evening traffic was audible and ordinary and entirely separate from this conversation. I'll think about it, she said. He wanted to push. He didn't. Tonight I'm moving Tessa to somewhere safer, he said. I'm telling you because you should know. I won't tell you where. Not because I don't trust you, but because if someone is watching you, what you don't know can't be gotten from you. That landed visibly. She processed it, nodded. And the rest of it, he said quietly. What we talked about the other night. The question I asked you. I still need an answer. I don't need it tonight, but I need it. She looked at him. Her expression had too many things in it to name individually. I know, she said. He moved to leave. She didn't call him back. He hadn't expected her to. He moved Tessa that same night at 9 p.m. using a car borrowed from Marcus Decker's contact in the city, a woman named June who had once done 3 years of protective detail work and now ran a safe house network out of a brownstone in Brooklyn. Tessa went under the cover of a special sleepover that Callum had constructed with enough enthusiasm that she had been too excited about the new location's promised proximity to a park with ducks to ask why they were traveling in an unfamiliar car at bedtime. In the car, she fell asleep against his shoulder. He sat with one arm around her and watched the streets pass and allowed himself, for approximately 4 minutes, to feel the full weight of everything he was carrying. Then she shifted in her sleep and said very quietly, Dad, the way children say a parent's name when they're not quite awake, not asking for anything, just confirming the presence. And he pressed his mouth to the top of her head and said, Right here. June met them at the door. She was 50, practical, and had a spare room set up with extraordinary competence. Callum carried Tessa in and laid her down without waking her, and then he and June stood in the hallway, and he gave her the necessary information in the necessary order, and she took it without drama, which was one of the things he had always respected about her. How long? June asked. I don't know. Days. I'll check in every 12 hours. She nodded. She'll be fine. He looked through the doorway at his daughter's sleeping shape under the quilt. 8 years old. Sea turtles and strong opinions and absolute conviction that the people she loved would keep her safe. Yeah, he said. She will. He was back in his apartment by midnight, alone. The building was quiet and the street below was not. The white panel van was back, same position, engine idling. And he stood at the kitchen window and looked at it and felt the familiar narrowing of focus that came when a situation stopped being theoretical. He had not told Sienna about the phone at the back of the drawer. He had not told her everything there was to know about what the Kandahar operation had involved, or what he had done specifically, or the specific nature of the personal threat that Rourke Vesper had made at the time of his extraction. Not a vague statement of revenge, but a precise one, outlining exactly the categories of damage he intended and the order in which he intended to inflict them. Callum went to the drawer. He took out the old phone. He held it for a moment, then set it on the counter and went to make coffee. He wasn't going to drink, because sometimes you needed something to do with your hands while you figured out how bad things had gotten. He was 3 steps from the counter when something slid under the apartment door. He heard it, just the whisper of paper on hardwood, and he was at the door in 2 seconds. He opened it. The hallway was empty in both directions. He stepped out, checked the stairwell at both ends, found nothing. Whoever had delivered it had not used the elevator. He picked up what they'd left. It was a photograph, printed on regular paper, slightly warm, like it had come off a printer in the last 10 minutes. It showed Sienna leaving their apartment building, this building, that door, wearing the blue coat she'd put on this morning. The photo had been taken from street level, close enough to show the tiredness in her face. He turned it over. 6 words, written in clean block capitals, with a black marker. You saved them. Now save her. He stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then he went back inside, closed the door, and turned on the old phone. The old phone took 4 minutes to power up fully, and Callum spent those 4 minutes standing at the kitchen counter reading the 6 words on the back of the photograph over and over, the way you read something when you already understand it, but need a moment before you act on the understanding. You saved them. Now save her. It was not a warning. Warnings came from people who wanted you to back down. This was something else, a provocation designed to tell him that Rourke knew exactly who he was dealing with, and wanted Callum to know that Rourke knew, because men like Rourke Vesper operated on the principle that terror was more efficient than force. Keep the target afraid, keep him reactive, make him feel the walls before you close them. The problem with that principle, when applied to Callum Renford, was that it assumed the target's primary response to fear was paralysis. His was not. The phone finished loading. He had 3 numbers stored in it. He called Decker. Decker picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting. They made contact, Callum said. How? Photograph. Under the door. Her leaving the building this morning. He turned the photo over once, then set it face down on the counter. 6 words on the back. Specific? Specific enough. He paused. They know I made the connection. They wanted me to know they know. Decker was quiet for a moment. This changes the timeline. Yes. The gala is Saturday. Yes. You couldn't get her to cancel. Callum looked at the window, at the street below where the van continued its patient idling. She said she'd think about it. The silence on Decker's end carried a particular quality, not judgment, but the kind of restraint that stood in for it. I can have 2 people on the perimeter by tomorrow night, discreet. But Callum, if Rourke has already positioned assets inside the event, he has. Callum said it without hesitation, because it wasn't a conclusion. It was a deduction from the facts he already had. Someone had repositioned that camera. Someone had placed a man in the parking structure. These were not exterior operations. They required interior access, which meant cooperation from someone already inside the building. He's had weeks. Then the gala isn't a target, it's a mechanism. Decker paused. He doesn't want to grab her in a room full of witnesses. He wants to use the event to move her somewhere else. The transport window. Callum had already worked this out, lying on his bed at 2 a.m. 3 days ago when sleep had stopped being available to him. Before or after? Controlled environment, limited witness exposure, natural explanation for vehicle movement. Probably after. People expect cars at the end of a gala. Decker stopped. You need to tell her everything tonight, Callum. Not the version you've been managing. Everything. He already knew that. He'd known it since the parking structure conversation, and he'd told himself he was being strategic, that more information would frighten her into decisions that would make the situation harder to manage, and he'd almost believed it long enough to get through another day. But the photograph had landed like a door closing. There was no more time for managed disclosure. I know, he said. One more thing. Decker's voice shifted into the register that meant what followed was going to be difficult. I pulled Vesper's full file today. Updated version, what exists in the networks I still have access to. A pause. His target in Kandahar, the hostages your team extracted. One of them talked to a journalist 2 years ago. Regional outlet didn't go wide, but they named names, yours included. Callum felt the specific coldness that lived below the sternum, the one he'd learned to function alongside rather than wait for it to pass. How long has Vesper had that article? Based on the timing of the surveillance pattern you've described, probably 8 weeks. 8 weeks. He had been on the executive floor of Carradine Dynamics for 14 months, invisible by design, and for 8 of those months someone had been building a file on him. He thought about Sienna walking past him every morning, and about Tessa at June's place with the ducks in the park, and about the particular efficiency with which Rourke Vesper had located him in a city of 8 million people. He used the company, Callum said. What? He used the accusation about the documents. He didn't just want to frame me. He wanted me pulled in front of the board. He wanted Sienna's attention on me as a liability, not as a threat she needed to take seriously, keep her distracted internally while he positioned externally. He pressed his hand flat against the counter. And Blaine Torek is involved. Another pause, longer this time. What makes you say that? Because the camera repositioning required building access approval, because the documents that disappeared were acquisition documents, the kind of thing a COO would have access to stage, because the security contractors who helped position men in this building were hired through a procurement channel that Torek controls. He'd been working this thread for 2 days without wanting to follow where it led, because following it meant Sienna's betrayal inside the company ran deeper than personal ambition. Torek didn't hire Rourke, but he hired people who were already Rourkes. He created the opening without understanding what he was opening. Decker made a sound that was not quite a word. "Get your people in position," Callum said. "I'll call you after I talk to her." He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for another 30 seconds. Then he picked up his regular phone and called Sienna. She answered on the fourth ring, which meant she'd been asleep, which meant it was later than he'd registered. "Callum." Her voice was thick with sleep and something else, the residue of a conversation they hadn't finished. "I need you to listen to me without asking questions until I'm done," he said. "Can you do that?" A beat. "Yes." He told her everything. She arrived at his apartment 40 minutes later. She'd thrown a coat over whatever she'd been wearing, her hair was loose, and she hadn't bothered with shoes that matched beyond the general category of shoes. She stood in his doorway for a moment before he stepped back to let her in, and she came in and sat down at the kitchen table in the chair she always took when they ate dinner here, the one facing the window, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her and looked at him. "Torek," she said. He didn't know what he was starting, but yes. She absorbed that. He watched the sequence of it move through her. Not panic, not disbelief, but a particular kind of fury that was all the more controlled for having nowhere immediate to go. "He was trying to destabilize me. He hired contractors to manufacture evidence against my—" She stopped. "Against you. And those contractors were already embedded with a man who wants to hurt us. Who wants to use you to hurt me. The distinction matters because it tells us what he'll do. Which is, he won't kill you. You're leverage, not a target. He needs you alive and reachable to bring me in." Callum sat across from her. The photograph was on the table between them, face up now. "He'll move you from a public location to a controlled one, and then contact me with terms." She looked at the photograph, at her own face on the sidewalk outside their building. "The gala," she said. "Yes." She was quiet. "Sienna. I heard you." She pressed her fingers to her mouth briefly, then lowered her hand. "If I cancel the gala, he adjusts. He finds another window. At least at the gala, I'm in a location we know, with people around. If we know what he's planning, we don't know exactly what he's planning. We know the general shape." "Is that enough?" He looked at her steadily. "It could be." She met his eyes. He could see her doing the calculation. Not the corporate calculation she'd been making for the past week, but a different one, more personal and more frightening. "You've done this before, situations where you knew the general shape and worked with that." "Yes." "Did it always work out?" He didn't look away. "No." She appreciated that. He could tell. She would have caught the lie immediately, and it would have cost them something they didn't have left to spend. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. Saturday arrived the way difficult days tend to, ordinary on the surface, with nothing in the weather or the light to distinguish it from any other October evening in the city. The gala was held in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, 12 blocks from Carradine Dynamics headquarters. 340 guests, by the final count. The event had been organized around the company's annual Partner Appreciation Dinner, which meant a significant portion of the attendees were external, clients, investors, regulatory contacts, which meant Torek could not simply fill the room with loyalists, and which meant Sienna's team of 3 could move through it without appearing to cluster protectively around her. Callum was not invited to the gala. He was, as far as anyone at the event was concerned, at home. He was, in fact, in the service corridor of the Meridian Hotel's subterranean level, in a dark jacket he'd bought 3 days ago and jeans that were not his facilities uniform, with an earpiece that Decker had couriered to June's brownstone that morning, and which connected him to a 2-person team positioned outside the hotel's 3 primary vehicle exits. He had also, in the pocket of the dark jacket, the old phone, and in his left hand, a hotel service map he'd obtained through a contact Decker had arranged, a former colleague who now ran hotel security across 4 Manhattan properties, and who owed Decker a favor of the kind that got repaid without questions. He knew the building. Not well. Not the way he knew Carradine Dynamics, where 14 months of 6-day weeks had given him the kind of intimate, granular knowledge of a space that you only develop by cleaning it, but well enough. I knew the service corridors, the loading dock exits, the camera positions, and their coverage gaps, and the specific tunnel that connected the hotel's lower level to the underground parking structure accessible from the service alley on the east side. He knew it because if he were Rourke Vesper, that tunnel was where he would move her. Inside the ballroom, Sienna was doing the work. She had not gotten where she was by being unable to function under pressure, and the performance she put on that evening, welcoming guests, moving through the room with the practiced warmth of someone who remembered names and made people feel seen, was one of the better ones she'd managed, given that she was simultaneously tracking the locations of 6 specific people Callum had identified as persons of interest, maintaining a running text thread with her security liaison in intervals timed to look like social phone checking, and managing the active awareness that somewhere in this building, or approaching it, was a man who had spent 8 weeks planning to use her as a tool for someone else's revenge. Torek was there. Of course he was. He arrived at 7:40 in a dark suit with a woman Sienna recognized as his wife, and he moved through the room with the comfortable authority of someone who believed the evening was proceeding according to his design. He stopped to talk to 2 board members. He laughed at something someone said near the bar. He smiled at Sienna from across the room with the particular warmth of a man who believed he was winning. She smiled back. It was not the hardest thing she had done this year, but it was in the conversation. At 9:15, her phone buzzed. The text read, "C2 confirmed, East Side." That was Decker's team. East Side vehicle exit was active. At 9:40, a second text, driver swap. Her car. She read it standing beside the bar, glass in hand, and did not change expression. They had switched her driver. Sometime in the previous 2 hours, her actual driver, a man named Patrick, who had worked for the company's executive transport for 6 years, had been replaced by someone else. She didn't know how. She didn't need to know how. She needed to know it had happened, and now she did. She sent one text back, confirmed. Then she moved through the room in the direction of the restrooms, which were in the east corridor, and instead of turning right into the restroom vestibule, she turned left at the first opportunity and walked to the service stair. What happened in the next 20 minutes had a specific quality that Sienna would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately, not to the police, not to the board, but to herself, in the quiet of her own memory, because it was the kind of experience that doesn't translate well and that changes things in ways you notice slowly. She had known the plan. She and Callum had worked through it in her apartment on Thursday night until 2 in the morning, both of them at the kitchen table, with a hotel floor plan printed from the service map he'd gotten and cups of coffee growing cold between them. She had known that if the text came through, she was to exit through the east service stair, go to the 4th sublevel of the parking structure, and wait in the section designated for hotel maintenance vehicles, which was visible from 2 camera positions Callum had already identified as blind spots for the hotel's security system. She had known all of that, and she had believed herself, when they'd planned it, to be the kind of person who could execute a plan under pressure, because she had done difficult things under pressure before. Board coups, regulatory investigations, a hostile acquisition attempt 2 years ago that had lasted 11 weeks and had required her to be in a room with people actively lying to her face every day while she worked to outmaneuver them. But those things had happened in suits and conference rooms, with lawyers and advisors and the specific armor of professional context. The East Service stair of the Meridian Hotel was concrete and fluorescent lit and extremely cold, and she was alone in it in a formal gown that made moving quickly difficult, and her heels were wrong for the surface, and the sound they made on each step seemed much louder than it had any right to be. She took the left shoe off at the second landing, then the right one. She carried them in one hand and went down 3 more flights in bare feet, which was not comfortable but was significantly quieter, and she did not stop to think about the cold concrete or the dress or any of it because the alternative was to stop moving, and stopping was the one thing she had decided she was not going to do. She reached the 4th sublevel. It was dark. The maintenance section was at the far end, past 2 rows of hotel vehicles, vans, a catering truck, 2 black sedans that were part of the hotel's car service. The fluorescent strips here flickered slightly, one of them cycling with an arrhythmic buzz that was the loudest thing in the space. She moved to the maintenance section and found the marked position, a yellow-painted column with a maintenance tag, and stood there, shoes in one hand, bare feet on cold concrete, breathing carefully. 2 minutes passed. Then she heard footsteps. They came from the wrong direction. She registered that fact with a clarity that surprised her. Not from the ramp she'd come down, not from the direction of the service corridor, but from the connecting tunnel on the east wall. 3 sets of footsteps, moving with the particular rhythm of people who knew where they were going. She looked around the maintenance section. There was a secondary utility panel on the wall to her right, a gray metal box, industrial, standard hotel infrastructure, for managing the structure's ventilation and drainage systems. She'd seen one like it in the plan. Callum had pointed it out. He'd said, if the extraction goes sideways, anything that makes noise or creates confusion buys time. She crossed to the panel in 3 steps and pulled it open. It was a fire suppression control node, pressure valves, manual override switches, an emergency trigger that was clearly marked in red. She had never triggered a building emergency system before. She thought briefly about the chaos it would cause. She thought about the footsteps, which were now close enough that she could hear the specific quality of them, 2 heavier, 1 lighter, all purposeful, and she pulled the red handle. The alarm was not subtle. Callum heard it through the earpiece as he was already moving. He had been in the service corridor on the sublevel below the parking structure when Decker's second operative had reported 2 men entering the connecting tunnel from the east, and he had started moving before the alarm triggered, because 2 men entering from that direction at that moment meant someone had found Sienna's position. But the alarm changed the geometry instantly. It pulled attention, triggered hotel security protocols, activated the overhead emergency lighting that turned the parking structure from dark to strobed red, and created the specific kind of institutional chaos that cleared corridors faster than any physical action could. He came through the service door into the parking structure at a dead run. The 2 men in the maintenance section were pulling up short, recalibrating, because the alarm had altered the plan. The plan had been a quiet extraction, and a screaming fire alarm in a parking structure was not quiet, and professionals recognize when a plan has been compromised and shift accordingly. The shift cost them 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a great deal. Callum covered the distance between the service door and the maintenance section in the time it took the first man to turn around. And what happened in the following moments was not elegant or cinematic. It was fast and functional and deliberately targeted, the product of years of training applied to the single purpose of removing 2 men from a position without a firearm. Because a firearm in an enclosed concrete structure with emergency systems active and hotel security incoming was a compounding problem, not a solution. The first man went down. The second lasted longer. He was well trained, which Callum registered with a kind of professional acknowledgement separate from any other feeling. And there was a period of approximately 40 seconds that Callum would not have described as comfortable. But it ended, and both men were down, and he was across the maintenance section before the ringing in his left ear from a hit he'd taken had fully resolved. Sienna was behind the yellow column. She was standing upright. She had her shoes in one hand. Her dress had a tear at the hem from where she'd moved through something in the service stair. Her feet were bare on the concrete, and she was looking at him with an expression that was complicated enough that he couldn't name all of its components. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She glanced at the 2 men on the ground. "Are you?" "Not seriously." He touched his left ear, which was going to be sore for several days. "We need to move. Rourke isn't here yet. Those were advance. The tunnel from the east is where he'll come through, and the alarm is going to compress his timeline." "I triggered it. I know. It was the right call." He meant that. She'd bought him the 4 seconds. "Can you move fast in that?" She looked at the dress. Then she grabbed the torn hem and tore it further, up to the knee. "Now I can." He almost said something. He decided there would be time for it later. "Stay close," he said. "Don't stop for anything." They moved. The tunnel from the east ran 200 feet between the hotel's parking structure and a loading bay that had originally been designed for the industrial vehicles that serviced the building's kitchen operation. It was narrow, low-ceilinged, lit by a strip of fluorescence on one side, and it smelled of diesel and standing water. It was also, at this particular moment, the only route through which Rourke Vesper could approach from his established position without crossing open street level where Decker's operatives were posted. Callum knew Rourke would come through the tunnel because Rourke had the same information about the hotel's exterior coverage that Callum had, meaning he had the same service map, obtained through the same kind of channels, because Rourke Vesper had not rebuilt his organization by being careless about preparation. He would know the exterior was covered. He would come through the tunnel because the tunnel was the last covered approach. And Callum wanted him in the tunnel because the tunnel was a controlled space with one entry and one exit, and Rourke's advantage was in his organization, his numbers, his ability to coordinate multiple assets across multiple positions. In the tunnel, he had a narrow frontage. In the tunnel, organizational advantage collapsed to a corridor. What Callum had not fully accounted for was that Rourke would come personally. He had expected a third team, another advanced group, another set of operatives moving to recover the situation when the first two failed to report. He had not expected the man himself, because in Callum's operational experience, people who ran organizations of Rourke-Vesper's scale did not expose themselves at the execution level. They managed from distance. They insulated. But when the figure appeared at the far end of the tunnel, flanked by two men on either side, and the figure stopped at a distance of 30 feet and said, in a voice that Callum recognized despite not having heard it in 6 years, "Hello, Callum." That was Rourke-Vesper himself. He was shorter than Callum remembered, or perhaps the tunnel made distances unreliable. He was wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt, and he looked less like a man running an international kidnapping network than like someone's well-dressed uncle, which had always been, according to the operational files Decker had access to, one of his significant advantages. Sienna was slightly behind Callum's left shoulder. He could feel her stillness, controlled, deliberate, the stillness of someone who had decided not to move until they understood the geometry. "You went to a lot of trouble," Callum said. "You went to more." Rourke's voice was conversational. He made no gesture to the men flanking him, which meant either they had standing orders or he had decided the conversation was the opening position, not the assault. 6 years, a janitor. I have to say, for someone who wanted to disappear, you disappeared very specifically. Same city, same industry. A pause. Same kind of work. Different reasons. Are they? Rourke took one step forward. The men beside him did not move. You put men in cages, Callum. You did it because you believed you were correct. So did I. The difference between us is what we were willing to protect. I was protecting people. You were protecting a revenue stream. The sound Rourke made was not quite a laugh. Was I? That's the version they gave you. Another step. The men your team extracted were witnesses to something your government did not want witnessed. Did Decker tell you that part? Did the file include the section on what those hostages were doing in that facility before they were hostages? Callum said nothing, because he didn't know. And Rourke could see that he didn't know and was using it, and Callum recognized the technique. Introduce uncertainty, destabilize the target's sense of ground, reframe the moral structure of the confrontation. He'd been trained against it. He knew it when he saw it. But knowing a technique didn't make you immune to it. You could have remained invisible, Rourke said. You were very good at it, actually. If you'd stayed alone. I know, Callum said. You've already told me that on a piece of paper. A beat. You can't go back to invisible, can you? Rourke said. He looked at Sienna, then back at Callum. Not a threat, an observation. That's the problem with loving people. They make you visible. Callum heard what Rourke was doing. He was positioning this as a philosophical standoff. He was trying to slow the momentum, to hold Callum in conversation while something repositioned behind them. Not the men in front, but a third angle, because Rourke always worked with 3 angles, and the tunnel had only looked like it had one entry and one exit. Callum had accounted for this. Sienna had not, because she hadn't been told, because there had been a limit to how much he could put in her hands without overloading the plan. But she had also spent the last 72 hours paying attention in a way that he had noticed and not remarked on. And when the sound came from the utility door 15 feet to their right, the specific sound of a handle being tested from the other side, she did not freeze. She moved to the security panel on the tunnel wall, the same type of industrial control node she'd found in the parking structure, because the hotel's systems were standardized across levels. And she pulled the override. The tunnel doors locked. All of them, including the utility door. The sound from the other side became a different kind of sound. Rourke looked at her for the first time with something other than instrument assessment. She's resourceful, he said to Callum. Yes, Callum said. She is. And then he moved. He moved quickly and without announcement, the way he'd learned to move in situations where announcement only benefited the other party, and the next 2 minutes in the tunnel were the kind of 2 minutes that do not benefit from extended description. Violent, efficient, and concluded with Rourke Vesper on the ground, wrists zip-tied with a length of cable from the utility panel that Sienna had torn free without being asked, and his 2 associates in similar condition 6 feet away. Callum was breathing harder than he'd have liked. His left ear was still ringing. His right hand was going to swell significantly by morning from a specific impact that had connected at the wrong angle. He crouched beside Rourke and said quietly, "I don't know what was in that facility. Maybe you're right about what it means, but you came for my daughter. Whatever else is true, that's what I know about you." Rourke said nothing. Callum stood. Above them, the building's alarms were still sounding. He could hear, distantly, the arrival of additional vehicles outside. Decker's people had called it in, and the specific combination of sounds that followed told him law enforcement was on the perimeter. He turned to Sienna. She was standing in the tunnel with cable ties in one hand and her torn dress and bare feet, and an expression that he was not going to be able to fully read until they were somewhere quieter and had more time than the next 4 minutes. "Are you hurt?" he said again. "You already asked me that." "Asking again." She looked at him, at his face specifically, in the way she'd looked at him in the parking structure 3 days ago, trying to find the line between surface and depth. Then she crossed the tunnel and put her hand against the side of his face that wasn't the one his ear was ringing in, and he stood very still. "Later," she said. "Let's get out of here first." He nodded. He took her hand and they moved toward the exit, and outside the tunnel, above the service alley on the east side of the Meridian Hotel, the night was cold and lit with the particular blue and red of approaching emergency vehicles, and there were cameras already. Someone had called someone, or someone always had a camera now. And Sienna emerged from the hotel's loading bay door in a torn gown and bare feet, holding the hand of a man in a dark jacket and jeans, and the cameras caught it. They caught the moment she looked at him. They caught the moment she stopped walking and turned to face the gathered reporters and onlookers and personnel, and the moment she reached up with her free hand and took his face between her palms the way she had in the tunnel, except now there were lights on them and 30 witnesses, and she did it anyway. She kissed him. Then she stepped back and looked at the stunned face of a reporter who had arrived without a press credential and was holding a phone camera with his mouth slightly open. "He's my husband," she said. The night air took it. The cameras kept rolling. Callum stood beside her in the service alley of a hotel in Manhattan with a ringing ear and a hand that was already beginning to swell, and he looked at his wife standing in her torn dress with her bare feet on the cold asphalt, and she was not performing anything. She was not calculating. She was not managing a narrative or protecting an image or making a board-ready decision. She was just standing there, in the cold, telling the truth. It was the most he had ever felt for her. The story was everywhere by 6 in the morning. Not the version that had actually happened, the tunnel, the locked doors, the 2 men on the ground in the parking structure, but the version that cameras and social media and the particular alchemy of public interest had assembled from the fragments available. A CEO in a torn gown, barefoot on a service alley, kissing a man in jeans while emergency lights strobed behind them. The clip ran 11 seconds. By midnight, it had been viewed 4 million times. By 6 a.m., it had been viewed 11 million. And by the time Sienna's communications director called her at 7:15, barely coherent with the effort of managing the incoming press volume, it had acquired the specific momentum of a story that was no longer controllable through ordinary channels. Sienna was sitting in the hospital waiting area when the call came in. She had not left Callum's side from the moment they'd emerged from the hotel until the moment a paramedic had examined his hand, 2 fingers fractured, which he had described as not ideal, with the flat affect of someone reporting minor weather. And then she had sat beside him in the emergency room while they wrapped it, and then in the waiting area while the police conducted the preliminary interviews, and she had answered her phone approximately 30 times in 4 hours, each call requiring a different calibration of tone and information. She was still in the torn dress. She had borrowed a pair of compression socks from a nurse who had offered them with the practical sympathy of someone who had seen stranger things. "I need a statement," her communications director said. His name was Owen Park, and he was 34 and genuinely good at his job and currently sounded like he had been awake for 2 days. "Something from you today that we control. Because right now the story is being written by everyone except us, and the versions I'm seeing are, What versions are you seeing? A pause. The charitable one is CEO secretly married facilities worker, relationship revealed dramatically during apparent kidnapping attempt. The less charitable ones involve words like reckless and hidden conflicts of interest, and one outlet is already speculating that the marriage was some kind of... He stopped. Say it, Owen. Tax arrangement. She absorbed that. And Blaine's people? Nothing official yet, but I've had 2 calls this morning from board members who are... concerned is the diplomatic word. Hargrove called at 5:30 a.m., which tells you his level of concern. Edmund Hargrove was 71 and had been on the board for 18 years and had the specific quality of institutional patience that could outlast almost any crisis if properly managed. The fact that he had called at 5:30 meant he had been awake at 5:30, which meant he had not slept, which meant the concern was genuine rather than performative. Tell Hargrove I'll meet with the board at noon, she said. Full meeting, everyone present. A beat. Sienna, are you sure you want to do it that fast? She looked across the waiting area at Callum, who was sitting in a plastic chair with his wrapped hand resting on his knee, talking to a detective with the unhurried patience of someone who had given statements to law enforcement before and understood the process. He looked tired. He also looked fundamentally unshaken, which was either admirable or infuriating depending on what hour of the morning it was and how many calls she'd taken. I'm sure, she said. Set it up. She went home at 9, showered, changed, and was back at Carradine Dynamics by 10:45. She told her driver, Patrick, the real one, who had been found locked in a utility room in the hotel's basement and was physically unharmed but comprehensively furious, to take her through the main entrance, which was what she always did, and which had the specific quality today of feeling like a statement, even though it was simply the way she went to work. The lobby was different and also exactly the same. The marble was still white. The ceilings were still 60 feet up. Derek was still at the reception desk. But the quality of attention in the room had changed. The way attention changes in a space when something has happened that everyone knows about and no one is certain how to reference. People looked at her. Some looked away quickly. Some held the look a moment too long. One of the junior analysts said, "Good morning, Ms. Carradine," in a voice that was slightly more deliberate than usual, as if he had thought about whether to say it. She said good morning back and took the elevator up. In her office, she sat at her desk for exactly 4 minutes doing nothing except looking at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 30 years old, CEO of a company her father had started in a 2-room office in Midtown, and which now occupied 14 floors of a building with a marble lobby. She had worked for this office and everything it represented since she was 22, and she had protected it with every decision she made. And some of those decisions had been good ones, and some of them had been the decisions of a woman so afraid of being dismissed that she had quietly dismissed the people she loved first, before anyone else could. She thought about Callum in the emergency room, about the wrapped hand and the flat description of "not ideal," about a photograph slid under an apartment door and a 6-word message that had been meant to terrify and had instead clarified something. For both of them, she thought, though they hadn't had time to talk about it properly yet. She thought about 18 months of walking past him in the lobby. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up the board meeting agenda her assistant had prepared, and began editing it. The board meeting was scheduled for noon in the 34th floor conference room, which was the largest the building had. 14 board members. Sienna's executive team, minus Torek, who had been informed that morning by building security, acting on instructions Sienna had issued at 7 a.m., that his access credentials had been suspended pending investigation. He had called her personal phone twice. She had not answered. She arrived 2 minutes before noon. Everyone was already seated, which was not typical. Usually there was the milling period, the coffee gathering, the establishing of social position through seating choices. Today people had come in and sat down quickly, which told her they had been talking before she arrived and had needed the time. Edmund Hargrove was at the far end of the table. He was a long man, angular, with white hair cut close, and the kind of face that had settled into permanent seriousness around age 40 and hadn't moved much since. He watched her come in with an expression she couldn't read, which was unusual for Hargrove. She could normally read him fairly well. She sat at the head of the table. "Thank you all for coming on short notice," she said. "I'll be brief on the situation summary because I assume everyone has seen the news and the police report that was filed this morning. Rourke Vesper and 4 associates are in federal custody. The kidnapping operation is a federal matter now, and I'll cooperate fully with that investigation. Blaine Torrick's role in providing the security contractors who facilitated access to this building is documented, and he has been suspended pending the outcome of that inquiry. She paused. I want to spend the time we have today on the other matter. Hargrove said, The marriage. Yes, silence. Not hostile, not yet, but attentive in the way that silence gets before a room decides what it is. A board member named Catherine Voss, who ran a private equity firm and had always been one of the more direct voices at the table, said, How long? 19 months. Voss processed that. You've been married to an employee of this company for 19 months and disclosed it to no one. That's correct? That's not a footnote, Sienna. That's a material fact with potential implications for, I know what it is. She said it calmly, not defensively. I'm not here to minimize it or explain it away. I'm here to tell you what it actually was, and then I'm going to tell you something harder. The room was quiet. I hid the marriage because I was afraid, she said. Not because it created a genuine conflict of interest. My husband had no authority, no access to sensitive operations, no influence over any decision within this company. He cleaned the building. The legal exposure is minimal, and I have counsel's assessment to support that if the board wants to review it. But the reason I hid it wasn't legal caution. It was personal fear. She let that sit. I was afraid that if you knew I had married a man who worked in facilities, you would use it to undermine my credibility. I was afraid of the word judgment. The particular way that word gets used when a young woman in a leadership position does something that powerful men around her find inconvenient or surprising. Voss looked at her without blinking. And I was right to be afraid of that, Sienna continued, because some of you would have used it. Not all of you, but some. And I knew which ones. She looked around the table with a specificity that made two people shift slightly in their chairs. But being right about the risk doesn't make what I did acceptable, because the cost of what I did wasn't paid by me. She stopped, started again. My husband spent 19 months walking into this building every morning and being treated as invisible. He was insulted in this lobby by a senior vice president while I was standing 4 feet away and I said nothing. He was accused in front of this board of stealing documents he had nothing to do with, and I defended him carefully and partially and stopped well short of telling the truth about who he was to me. She looked at her hands on the table. He never asked me to do any of that. He accepted it because he loved me and because he understood what I was afraid of. And that's the part I can't make acceptable no matter how I frame it. The fact that his acceptance of it made it possible for me to keep doing it. The room held the kind of silence that a room holds when it has been given something real and doesn't quite know yet what to do with it. Hargrove spoke. His voice was measured, as it always was. Not cold, but not warm. The voice of someone who had spent 50 years making consequential decisions and had learned not to make them from his immediate reactions. You're describing a failure of transparency. Yes. Toward the board, and toward your husband. She met his eyes. Yes. Those are separate problems. I know. The second one is mine to solve. The first one is why I'm sitting here. A pause. Hargrove looked at the table briefly, then back at her. The legal exposure, as you say, appears to be limited. The optics are complex. A small pause on the word, which was Hargrove's version of an understatement. There will be coverage. There will be questions about governance. He folded his hands. What I want to know, before we discuss any of that, is whether this is the last of it. Whether there is anything else material that this board does not know. The documents Blaine claimed were not stolen by my husband. Electronic records that were provided to federal investigators this morning show that Torrick staged the disappearance to create an internal crisis. Those records were obtained by my husband, who identified the manipulation and documented it before the gala. She watched Hargrove process this. He found what your own security team didn't find. The silence shifted slightly. He was protecting you, Voss said. It was not entirely a question. He was doing what he does, Sienna said, which is pay attention to things other people decide aren't worth paying attention to. The board did not vote that afternoon to remove her. This was not, Sienna understood, purely a function of goodwill or the moral force of her honesty. Boards were organisms, and organisms responded to conditions, and the conditions present in that room included the following: that the story dominating public coverage was not a scandal about a CEO's hidden marriage, but a story about a CEO's husband, former military, currently employed in a building his wife ran, who had identified a threat that professional security had missed and had gone into a hotel tunnel alone to address it. The 11-second clip of Sienna kissing him in the service alley had not, it turned out, read to the public as reckless or compromised. It had read as human. Several board members had, Sienna suspected, done the quick calculation of which version of this story was better for the company's public standing, and had concluded that removing her this week would look like exactly the kind of institutional tone deafness that boards spent enormous amounts of money trying to avoid looking like. She was not naive about that. She had spent 8 years in corporate leadership. She knew what a board looked like when it was moved by principle and what it looked like when it was moved by market awareness. And these two things produce similar decisions for different reasons, and you accepted the outcome either way. What mattered was what she did with the time it bought her. She called Callum at 2:15. He answered on the third ring, which was unusual. He almost always answered immediately. She heard background sound, a child's voice, the specific acoustic quality of a space she recognized. "Are you at June's?" she asked. "Yeah, Tessa wanted—" She heard something on the news. She had questions. A brief pause. "She's okay. She was more interested in the tunnel logistics than anything else, honestly. Asked me to draw a diagram." Sienna closed her eyes briefly. Of course she did. The board? Still in session, technically. Hargrove called a recess. They'll finish tomorrow morning. She turned her chair toward the window. "I don't think they're going to remove me." Good. The word was simple and complete, and she felt the specific inadequacy of phone calls for certain kinds of conversations, the way they flattened things that needed dimension. "Callum," she stopped. "I know," he said. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to try to apologize again." "I wasn't." "Yes, I was." She pressed her hand to her forehead. "I've been trying to figure out since last night how to say it correctly. I keep coming up with versions that are either too small or too large. Too small minimizes it. Too large makes it about my guilt instead of what I actually did to you." He was quiet for a moment. She heard Tessa's voice in the background say something, and Callum's response, low, brief. And then the background sounds receded slightly, as if he had moved to another room. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine," he said, "because it wasn't. The lobby thing, the board meeting thing, all of it. It wasn't fine, and we both know it, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise." "I know. But I'm also not interested in holding it over you indefinitely, because that's its own kind of damage, and I've seen what that does to people." He paused. What I actually want, not the diplomatic version, is for you to stop being afraid of the opinion of people who are never going to be on your side, regardless of what you did. Because you made 18 months of decisions based on the judgment of people who were actively working against you, and I was the one who paid for it. She sat with that. It was accurate. It was also the most direct he'd been with her in months, and she felt it as a relief rather than an attack. The relief of being told a true thing plainly, after a long time of circling around it. "The board meeting today," she said. "I told them I hid the marriage because I was afraid. I said it to 14 people. On the record." A pause. "How did that feel?" he said. "Terrifying, and then very simple." She looked out at the city. "I should have done it a year ago." "Yes." He said it without softening it, which she had asked him to do once, months ago, not soften things, and which he had taken seriously in a way that occasionally made her wish she hadn't asked. "But you're doing it now." "That's enough?" "It's a start." The word was deliberate, not punishing, but not reassuring either. Honest, which was, she had always known, one of the things that had made her fall in love with him, and also one of the things that had made loving him require more courage than she'd initially understood. "I want to come to June's tonight," she said. "If that's—" "Tessa already asked me if you were coming for dinner." Sienna felt something loosen in her chest. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd ask." A beat. She could hear the smile in his voice, barely, the way it lived just under the surface of his control. "So I'm asking." "I'll be there by 7. She was there by 6:50, because she left the office at 6:15 without waiting for anything to be finished, which was something she had not done in longer than she could clearly remember. June's brownstone was in a part of Brooklyn that was neither fashionable nor unfashionable, but simply present. Brownstones and corner stores and a park 2 blocks over with ducks, as advertised. Sienna had not been here before. She stood on the front step for a moment longer than necessary, her bag over her shoulder and a container of soup dumplings from the restaurant 3 blocks from Tessa's school. She had driven the additional distance specifically in her other hand. The door opened before she knocked. Tessa was in her pajamas, which were dark blue with small printed whales on them, and she was barefoot on the wooden floor, and she looked at Sienna with the particular expression she had, the one that assessed and concluded and declared its conclusion without apparent concern for whether the conclusion was convenient. "You got dumplings," Tessa said. "I did." "The good ones or the other ones?" "The good ones." Tessa stepped back from the door. "Okay," she said in the tone she used when a decision had been made and the matter was settled. "Come in." Sienna came in. June appeared from the kitchen, tall, practical, with the kind of face that had probably always been more interested in what people did than in how they looked, and took the dumplings without ceremony and said dinner would be 20 minutes and disappeared again. Callum was in the living room. He stood when she came in, which he always did, a habit so automatic she was certain he didn't notice it anymore. His hand was wrapped in a soft brace. He looked at her across the room with an expression she had spent 2 years learning to read and was still not always certain she was reading correctly. "Hi," she said. "Hi." Tessa pushed past both of them toward the kitchen to supervise the dumplings. They stood in the living room of June's brownstone with the sound of Tessa conducting a detailed quality control conversation with June about optimal dumpling temperature in the next room, and the ordinary lamplight and the ordinary smell of a household in the evening. And Sienna looked at her husband and felt the accumulated weight of 19 months settle into something she could finally put down. "The board will complete the session tomorrow morning," she said. "I think it's going to be okay." "Good." Torik's lawyers called this afternoon. They're trying to position his involvement with the contractors as a security procurement error rather than intentional facilitation. She paused. "It won't work. The electronic records are too specific." "I know." "How did you get them exactly?" He looked at her with the particular expression that meant the answer was going to require more context than the current moment allowed. "You remember the camera on the executive floor that was repositioned?" "Yes." "The repositioning created a new coverage angle. Whoever did it didn't realize that the new angle included a partial view of a monitor in the adjacent office. A monitor that Torik occasionally used when he was working late and didn't want to be in his own office." He paused. "I've been on that floor at 2 in the morning enough times to have captured footage over several weeks." She stared at him. "You recorded Torik's monitor from a security camera reflection." "It wasn't my plan. The camera moved and I noticed what it was covering. I adapted." "That's..." She stopped. "Is that admissible?" "I'm told it's complicated but workable. The federal investigators seem optimistic." He looked mildly uncomfortable with the word optimistic, which she had noticed he always did. He distrusted positive projections on principle. "Callum." She moved toward him, not quickly, just deliberately. The way you move toward something when you've stopped trying to decide whether you should. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as what it is, not as something I'm saying to resolve a situation." He waited. "I don't want the marriage we had before. I don't want to go back to what worked, because what worked was only working for me. What I want is something that costs me what it should have cost me from the beginning." She stopped in front of him. "I'm not asking you to forget the last 19 months. I'm asking if you want to try something different with me, knowing that I already failed once, knowing it'll be harder because of that." She looked at him. "I'm not making a pitch. I'm asking an actual question." He was quiet for long enough that she felt the uncertainty settle in. Not panic, but the specific quiet discomfort of having said the true thing and not knowing what comes back. Then he said, "I married you because I knew what kind of person you were, not what kind of person you were performing. I knew you were afraid. I knew the fear would cost us something. I thought it would cost less than it did." He paused. "But I still knew. So I'm not standing here as someone who was blindsided." "That doesn't answer the question." "I'm getting there." He looked at her with the steadiness that she had mistaken early on for detachment, before she understood it was the opposite. "Yes, I want to try the different thing. But Sienna, you have to actually try it. Not try it until it gets uncomfortable. Not try it until a board meeting makes it feel risky again. Actually try it. I know. Do you? Yes. She said it without the qualifier she would have added 6 months ago. Just yes, flat and clear, the way he talked to her when he meant something completely. He looked at her for another moment. Then he reached out with his uninjured hand and took hers. Okay, he said. From the kitchen, Tessa's voice carried clearly through the brownstone. They're ready, and I tasted one for quality control, and it's good, so you should both come now before June makes me put down the container. Sienna laughed, actually laughed, the unguarded kind that she rarely produced in the presence of anyone other than these two people. And Callum's hand tightened briefly around hers before he let go, and they walked to the kitchen together in the ordinary lamplight of a Tuesday evening in Brooklyn. In the morning, Edmund Hargrove called a vote. The motion was a formal censure, not removal, but a documented record of the board's determination that Sienna had failed her disclosure obligations and that governance reforms would be implemented, including a broader policy on executive relationship transparency. The censure would be public, filed with the appropriate regulatory bodies, and would appear in the company's annual report. Sienna had been told about the censure motion the previous night, and she had had 12 hours to decide how she felt about it. She felt it was appropriate. She said as much to Hargrove before the meeting convened. He had been waiting by the elevator, which she suspected was deliberate. He was a man who used corridor conversations to say things he preferred not to say with 14 witnesses. You could contest it, he said. I know. The grounds for a formal censure are not unambiguous. Your counsel would likely recommend Edmund. She looked at him. He was 20 years her senior and had been formidable for so long that she suspected he'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. I kept my marriage secret for 19 months. The board was operating without information it should have had. The censure reflects that. I'll accept it. He studied her for a moment. The elevator arrived and neither of them got in. The public response to last night, he said carefully, has not been what some of us anticipated. I know. The clip, I know, Edmund. He was quiet. She watched something move behind his expression, not softness exactly, which was not in Hargrove's repertoire, but something adjacent to acknowledgement. Your husband, he said. He identified the threat inside this building before our security team did. Yes. How? She thought about Callum in his gray facilities uniform, pushing his cart through the building at 4 a.m, 6 days a week. Watching things. Noting which camera had moved and which parking attendant was out of place, and which van was idling too long on which street. He pays attention, she said. It's what he does. Hargrove considered this. Then he straightened his jacket, which was what he did when he was returning to formality after a brief departure from it. The meeting's in 3 minutes, he said. I know. Thank you, Edmund. He walked ahead of her into the conference room. She stood at the elevator for a moment, looking at the hallway that connected this floor to the one below, where a particular corridor ran past the supply closets and the facility's staff entrance and all the ordinary infrastructure of the building that most people on this floor had never had cause to look at. She thought about a man pushing a cart through an empty lobby at 4 a.m, watching, knowing, waiting, with a patience that she had always understood but had, for 19 months, chosen not to deserve. She was going to deserve it now. She walked into the conference room and sat down at the head of the table and accepted the censure with a yes. That was clear enough that no one in the room felt the need to ask for clarification, and the vote was recorded and the meeting moved on, and she let it move because some things needed to be on the record, and this was one of them, and she had made enough decisions based on what the record didn't show. It was time to be on it. The censure was filed on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, it had been reported on by every major financial publication, and by Thursday afternoon, those same publications were running secondary pieces about the 11-second clip, about the tunnel, about the former Navy SEAL who had been mopping floors in his wife's building for over a year while quietly identifying a threat that a professional security apparatus had missed entirely. The two stories sat side by side in the news cycle with the awkward proximity of things that complicated each other. The governance failure and the human story, the institutional accountability, and the fact that the institution's janitor had been the one to protect it. Sienna read the coverage on Thursday evening at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made and then ignored, the way she ignored most beverages she made when she was thinking. She had developed, over the past 4 days, a new and specific relationship with public attention. Not comfort exactly, but a kind of settled willingness to let it exist without trying to manage it into a shape she preferred. This was harder than it sounded. She had spent 8 years in a role that required her to understand how things appeared and to influence that appearance with considerable skill, and the instinct to do that did not simply switch off because she had decided it should. But she was trying. Callum came in from the bedroom, where he had been on the phone with Decker for the better part of an hour. His hand brace was the lighter version now. The orthopedist had cleared him to remove the heavier one after 2 days, which Callum had received as news with the satisfaction of someone whose primary concern had been the restriction rather than the injury. He looked at the untouched tea and then at her and sat down across the table without saying anything about either. "Decker," she asked. "Federal prosecutors want a formal debrief, Kandahar and everything after." He said it without particular weight, but she had learned to read the things Callum said without weight as the things that carried the most of it. They've been building a case against Vesper for 4 years in 3 jurisdictions. What happened at the hotel accelerated their timeline considerably. "Well, do you have to testify?" "Probably. In some form." He looked at the table. "There are things from that deployment that have never been in any public record. Some of them should stay that way. Some of them, based on what Rourke said in the tunnel, maybe shouldn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Decker is helping me work out which is which." She nodded. Then, "What he said? About the hostages? About what they'd witnessed?" Callum looked at her. "You've been thinking about it," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And?" He pressed his thumb against the edge of the table, a small habitual gesture she'd noticed he made when he was organizing something internally before he said it. "I did what I was told to do, in a context where the information I had was incomplete. That's true of most operational decisions. You act on what you know, and you don't find out what you didn't know until later, and sometimes later is 6 years in a tunnel in Midtown Manhattan." He paused. "I don't know yet what the full picture is. I'm not going to decide how I feel about it until I know." "That's very measured." "I'm a measured person." "You are," she agreed. "It's occasionally maddening." The corner of his mouth moved. "Only occasionally?" "The other times, it's the most reassuring thing about you." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight of their kitchen, in the apartment they had shared secretly for 19 months, and were now, for the first time, simply sharing, the wedding rings visible, her name on the lease amended 2 weeks ago. The particular ordinariness of a life that had stopped requiring management and could just be lived. It was not perfect. She wanted to be precise about that, at least to herself, because she had made enough decisions based on the performance of perfection to know what that cost. There were still mornings when she felt the residue of the old instinct, the lobby instinct, she had started calling it privately, the automatic calibration of what to reveal and to whom. There were still moments when Callum's stillness read to her as distance before she remembered it was simply how he was made. There were still conversations they needed to have about the next year, about what his role would be, about Tessa's school and the question of whether the Brooklyn Park with ducks was worth considering as a more permanent arrangement. There was still a lot of ordinary difficulty ahead, the kind that didn't make news and didn't resolve in tunnels, and required the sustained, unspectacular effort of 2 people who loved each other and were also, in specific ways, quite hard to live with. But they were having it in the same room now, without the weight of the secret between them, and that made it possible in a way it hadn't been before. Blaine Torek was formally arrested on a Friday, 5 weeks after the gala. The charges were extensive: corporate fraud, obstruction, and most significantly conspiracy in connection with the kidnapping attempt, on the basis that his contractors had knowingly facilitated access for Rourke Vesper's operatives. His lawyers were fighting the conspiracy charge with the energy of people who understood that everything else was, by comparison, manageable. The corporate fraud alone was likely to produce a settlement. The conspiracy charge was the one that could produce something considerably less manageable. Sienna learned about the arrest from her communications director, who texted her a Reuters alert at 8:40 on a Friday morning. She was in her car, on the way to the office, and she read the text and looked out the window at the city going past, and felt something she identified, after a moment, as relief that was not entirely clean, which was accurate. She had worked alongside Blaine Torek for 3 years. She had not liked him and had not trusted him and had understood from almost the beginning that he resented her presence in the role he had expected to occupy. But she had also worked with him, sat in rooms with him, navigated the specific dance of professional antagonism that long-term working relationships sometimes required. His arrest was the correct outcome of his choices. It was also the end of something, and endings of things, even things that needed to end, carried a weight that clean relief didn't quite account for. She put the phone in her bag and told her driver to take the long way. The restructuring of Carradine Dynamics took 4 months. It was not, as these things rarely are, a simple or clean process. Torek's removal created a vacuum in the operational leadership that required filling, and the candidates for his replacement included 2 internal ones who were qualified and 1 external one who was marginally more qualified, and who Sienna ultimately appointed after 6 weeks of interviews and 1 particularly clarifying conversation in which the candidate had said, without apparent awareness of how much it mattered, "I'm not here to be the smartest person in the room. I'm here to make sure the room works." She had offered him the position 2 days later. She also established, in the restructuring, a formal whistleblower protection policy that her legal team told her was unusually strong for a company of Carradine Dynamics' size. She established it because she had spent 3 years in a building where a man had noticed things, cameras repositioned, attendance out of place, documents that didn't add up, and had had no formal mechanism through which to raise those observations without risking his own position. She was not under the illusion that a policy fixed everything. She was aware that policies were only as effective as the culture that sat underneath them. But you built the culture by starting somewhere, and this was where she was starting. The board noted the policy in the quarterly governance review with language that was approving without being effusive, which was about as warm as governance reviews got, and Sienna accepted it as the institutional equivalent of a nod. Callum left Carradine Dynamics facilities team on the last day of November. His resignation was, in the technical sense, unnecessary. He could have stayed, under circumstances that were now entirely different, and nobody would have questioned it. But he and Sienna had talked about it over 3 separate evenings in October, and the conversation had each time arrived at the same place: that his presence on the facilities team created a dynamic that was difficult to navigate cleanly, that the people he worked with were either uncomfortable around him now or performatively respectful in ways that were exhausting in a different direction, and that the work itself, which he had genuinely not minded, the early mornings and the empty building and the specific meditative quality of cleaning a space while the city slept, had become something else once it was public. "I'll miss the building at 4 a.m., he told Sienna, and she had looked at him with an expression that was equal parts disbelief and recognition, because she had known he meant it, and she had also known that very few people in her life would have meant it, and that the distance between those 2 things was one of the reasons she had fallen in love with him. Marcus Decker, in one of his periodic calls, had mentioned an opening at a nonprofit organization that ran crisis intervention and de-escalation training for first responders, a program that needed someone to design the physical component of their curriculum, someone with practical background who could translate operational experience into teachable protocol. It was part-time, to start. It was not especially lucrative. It required him to be present and verbal in a way that did not come naturally and that he would need to actively work at. He took it. Tessa's opinion, solicited and delivered with her customary authority, was that this was a good decision because it meant he would be home when she got back from school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which was the optimal scheduling outcome from her perspective, and also because teaching people how to not panic in emergencies was basically what you do anyway, just officially now. Callum had looked at his daughter over this pronouncement and said, "That is a very accurate summary." Tessa had accepted this without apparent pride. She was not interested in being told she was perceptive. She was interested in being correct, which she generally was, and which she clearly felt was its own sufficient reward. The deposition for the federal case happened in December, in a conference room in a federal building in Lower Manhattan that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. Callum sat across from 2 prosecutors and a court reporter for 4.5 hours and described, in the precise and specific language that depositions require, the events of the Kandahar deployment, the intelligence they had received, the nature of the operation, the conditions of the facility, what the hostages had said in the hours after extraction. He also described, at the prosecutor's request and with Decker's guidance, what he had subsequently learned, or rather what he had not learned, the information that had been withheld from his team, the questions he had not been in a position to ask, because the operational context hadn't given him standing to ask them. This part of the deposition was classified at a level that meant it would not appear in the public record, which suited Callum in ways he didn't fully examine. What he did examine, walking out of the federal building into the December cold, was the specific texture of what Rourke had said in the tunnel. The question of whether the hostages had been witnesses to something that powerful interests preferred unwitnessed. He had spoken to Decker about it extensively, and Decker had spoken to people Decker spoke to, and the picture that had emerged was not simple and was not fully resolved, and was, Callum suspected, the kind of picture that would never be fully resolved because it existed in the specific zone of history where multiple things are simultaneously true, and the truth of each one complicates the others. He had done what he believed was right with the information he had in circumstances that were not of his choosing. The hostages had been in danger, and he had gotten them out. The rest of the picture, what they had witnessed, who had wanted them silenced, what role institutions he had served played in that, was real and mattered and deserved examination. But it was separate from what he had done, and he was learning, slowly and imperfectly, to hold those two things at once without letting either one cancel the other. He called Sienna from the steps of the federal building. She answered on the first ring, which she almost always did now. "How was it?" she said. "Long." He put his collar up against the cold. "Accurate, I think. We'll see what they do with it." "Are you okay?" He considered the question with the seriousness she had learned to give it time for. "Yes," he said. "I think so. Not fine, exactly, but okay. There's a difference." "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear the background sounds of her office, the particular hum of it, the city through the glass, the distant voice of her assistant. And it was ordinary and familiar, and he had mopped the floors of that office at 5 in the morning for 14 months, and he was standing in the December cold outside a federal building, and the distance between those two things was not distance at all, he realized. It was the same life, continuous, just finally lived in the open. "Come home," she said. "On my way." Tessa's school had a winter showcase in the second week of December, the kind of event that schools organized partly for the children and partly to give parents an occasion to gather and feel, collectively, that things were proceeding as they should. Tessa was presenting a project on sea turtle migration patterns that she had been working on since October, and that had expanded, in the manner of Tessa's projects generally, well beyond the assigned parameters. It included a hand-drawn map of the Atlantic, a chart of water temperature variations, and a typed report that was 11 pages and which she had not been asked to type but had decided the subject warranted. Sienna and Callum arrived together. This was not, in the objective sense, remarkable. Parents arrived together to school events all the time, but it was the first school event they had attended together publicly, and Callum was aware, in the way he was aware of most things, quietly and without making it visible, of the specific quality of attention that followed their entrance through the gymnasium doors. Other parents who recognized Sienna from the news coverage, teachers who had known Callum for 2 years as Tessa's father and were now recalibrating that knowledge in light of information they hadn't previously had. The particular recalibration that occurs when a person you have categorized in one way is suddenly revealed to occupy a different category, and the category you place them in turns out to have been insufficient. He had spent his adult life being categorized insufficiently. By employers, by institutions, by the specific social machinery that looks at a man in a gray work uniform and assigns him a position in the hierarchy of people worth paying attention to. He had not, mostly, been troubled by this. It was useful, sometimes, to be underestimated. It simplified certain things, but it had also cost him things he hadn't always let himself name, and standing in the gymnasium of his daughter's school with his wife beside him and her hand in his, he let himself name them quietly and then set them down. Tessa found them immediately. She appeared from the direction of the display tables in a green sweater and an expression of concentrated purpose, carrying a tube of poster materials under one arm and navigating the crowd with the efficiency of someone who had identified her objective and was not interested in the scenic route. "You're late," she said. "We're 3 minutes early," Callum said. "I meant emotionally late." She said this with the absolute confidence of someone who had no idea it was funny and would not have appreciated being told. Come look at the map. I need a second opinion on whether the Gulfstream arrow is positioned correctly. They followed her to the display table. The map was extraordinary, in the way that things made by children who take something seriously are extraordinary. Not technically perfect, but genuinely felt, every line and notation the product of real thought. Sienna stood beside Tessa and looked at it with the attention it deserved, which was the right response. And Tessa explained the Gulfstream arrow with the authority of someone presenting to a symposium, and Callum stood slightly behind both of them and watched and felt, in the uncomplicated way that the best moments allow, simply present. A woman appeared beside him. He recognized her vaguely. The mother of a boy in Tessa's class, someone he had spoken to briefly at 2 previous school events. She was looking at the map with genuine interest. "Your daughter made this?" she said. "She did. It's incredible. How old is she?" 8. The woman shook her head slightly. "My son would have drawn one turtle and called it done." She glanced at Sienna, then back at Callum, with the specific look of someone who had recognized her and was deciding whether to acknowledge it. "Your wife is... I saw the news. What happened at the hotel?" She paused. "I hope you're both okay." He looked at her. She was being genuine. He could tell the difference. "We're getting there," he said. "Thank you." She nodded and moved on, and Tessa looked back over her shoulder at Callum with the expression she wore when she had heard something and was filing it for later analysis, and he gave her a small nod that meant, "Yes, I saw. It's fine." She turned back to her map. January arrived with the particular quality of New York Januaries, gray and cold and aggressively ordinary, as if the city had decided that December's willingness to be atmospheric had been indulgent, and it was time to get back to business. Sienna had always found January clarifying for this reason. It stripped away the performance of the holiday season and left things as they actually were, which was sometimes uncomfortable and always useful. She was in the office by 7:30 most mornings. This had not changed. What had changed was the quality of the 7:30. She was not arriving early to prove something or to be visible or to demonstrate to anyone that she was serious. She was arriving early because she was genuinely interested in the work, and that interest was, she had discovered, significantly more sustainable as a fuel source than the anxiety that had been powering her for the better part of 3 years. The company was steadier than it had been in the 6 months before the gala. The new COO had, in his first 8 weeks, identified 3 operational inefficiencies that Torik's tenure had calcified into policy, and had begun dismantling them with the specific energy of someone who had been given genuine authority and was using it. The merger that the stolen acquisition documents had nearly derailed was back on track. The target company's leadership had, in the aftermath of Torik's arrest, and the public disclosure of what he had been doing, expressed their renewed confidence in Carradine Dynamics management with a directness that Sienna's legal team said was unusual, and her communications director said was, from a press perspective, extremely helpful. She received a letter in January from Edmund Hargrove. An actual letter, typed on paper, sent through the post, which was so specific to Hargrove's particular brand of formality that she had smiled at the envelope before she opened it. It was 3 paragraphs. The first reviewed the board's position on the governance reforms and expressed their satisfaction with the implementation timeline. The second noted the positive direction of the Q4 financials. The third paragraph was 4 sentences long. "I want to say something that does not belong in a board meeting, but perhaps belongs somewhere. I have watched a great many leaders in my time manage crises. The ones who survive them, in the fullest sense of the word, are the ones who understand that surviving is not the same as accounting for. What you did in that conference room in November was not good strategy. It was something rarer." She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the drawer where she kept things she wanted to keep. Rourke Vesper's trial began in March of the following year. Callum did not attend. He had given his deposition, he had provided the material the prosecutors needed, and he had made the decision, discussed with Decker, discussed with Sienna, ultimately made alone in the way that decisions of this kind have to be, that his presence in the courtroom would not add anything beyond what was already in the record, and that there were other things he wanted to do with the time. He spent the first day of the trial at the nonprofit's training facility in Queens, running a de-escalation scenario with a group of 12 first responders who had been referred by their department for the advanced module. The scenario was complex, a multi-party conflict with incomplete information and a time constraint. And watching the responders navigate it, watching them apply the framework he had spent months helping to build, he felt the specific satisfaction of useful work. Not heroic work, not the kind that produced 11-second clips or news coverage, just the kind that made a practical difference in situations that would otherwise go worse. He drove home through a Queens afternoon that was just starting to think about spring, the particular quality of late March light that is still cold but has begun to remember it doesn't have to be. And he thought about Rourke Vesper's question in the tunnel, about being visible, about the cost of loving people. The cost was real. He had never pretended it wasn't. He had watched it play out over 19 months in ways that had required him to swallow things he would rather have said, to absorb things he would rather have refused, to stay in a situation that had costs. He bore alone because the alternative was a kind of solitude he had also experienced, and which had its own costs, quieter but cumulative. He had chosen visibility. He had chosen it again, every morning, pushing the cart through the lobby while she walked past. He was still choosing it. That was the thing about love that nobody told you adequately, he thought. Not the falling part, which was easy, which happened to you, but the staying part, which you had to keep choosing when it was inconvenient, and when the person you were choosing was also choosing imperfectly, and when the whole thing was ongoing and unfinished and would continue to be unfinished for as long as both of you were in it. He chose it anyway, not because it was easy or because the past 19 months hadn't cost him, or because he was certain it wouldn't cost him again. He chose it because the alternative, the invisible life, the protected life, the life organized around the reduction of risk, was not a life he was willing to live anymore. Maybe that was the thing Rourke had never understood, despite all his precision and his patience and his talent for identifying vulnerabilities. He had identified Callum's vulnerability correctly, the people he loved, the visibility they created. He had just misread what that visibility meant to Callum. He had read it as weakness, as exposure, as the lever you pull to bring a man down. He had not understood that for Callum, it was the point. On the first genuinely warm day of April, the kind of day where the city seems to exhale something it has been holding since November, Sienna walked through the lobby of Carradine Dynamics wearing her wedding ring on the correct finger in plain sight. She had been doing this since December. It was not by April a notable event in any external sense. The news cycle had moved on. The employees who worked in the building had absorbed the information about their CEO's marriage with the varied reactions that large groups of people produce, some interested, some indifferent, some quietly pleased for reasons they probably couldn't have articulated. And the marble lobby had returned to the ordinary business of being a lobby. But she noticed it each time, not with anxiety, with something more like inventory, the way you check a thing to confirm it is still present, not because you doubt it, but because confirmation has its own quiet value. Callum was waiting near the elevator bank. He was there because Tessa had a spring showcase at her school that evening, and they were leaving directly from the office, and he had come to meet Sienna here because it was on the way, and also because Tessa had specifically requested that they all arrive together, and Tessa's requests had the quality of reasonable expectations that one generally met. He was wearing a jacket she hadn't seen before, dark blue, well-fitted, and he was looking at his phone with the expression he wore when he was reading something that required more attention than his phone usually got. He hadn't seen her come in. She stopped for a moment. She thought about the first morning she had walked past him. Not the first morning she had done it deliberately, with the careful practiced blindness she had developed over months. But the very first morning, before the system was established, before the avoidance had become reflexive, the morning when she had come through the revolving door and seen him across the lobby with his cart and had felt the collision of two parts of her life occurring in a space she had organized to keep them separate. The discomfort of that morning. The specific quality of a person you love becoming someone you must pretend not to know. She had not known then what that pretending would become. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself the right moment was coming. She had found the right moment insufficient, in practice, every single morning for over a year. She knew what it had cost. She also knew that the cost had been paid, and that what remained was not debt but consequence. The ongoing daily consequence of having chosen, late, to do the right thing, which manifested not as punishment, but as the particular awareness of someone who has learned something the hard way and carries that learning into everything subsequent. You don't get to forget what it cost. You just get to make sure it buys something. She crossed the lobby. He looked up when she was 6 feet away, and the expression that moved across his face was not dramatic. It was the quiet, settled expression of a man seeing someone he was glad to see, in a context that was no longer complicated by anything except the ordinary complications of being two people who shared a life. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She stopped in front of him. "How long have you been waiting?" 12 minutes. There was a deposition document I needed to review." He pocketed his phone. "Ready?" "Almost." She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She shook her head. I just... nothing. Let's go." But he knew her well enough by now to read the specific quality of her nothing, and he waited, which was what he did, and she looked at the lobby around them, the marble and the light and the elevators and the reception desk where Derek was doing whatever Derek was doing, and she said quietly, so it was only for him, "I'm sorry I wasted so much of it." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that he used for the things that mattered. "We didn't waste it," he said. "We just took the long way." She looked at him. "Still got here," he said. She pressed her hand briefly to his arm, just a hand on an arm, the ordinary gesture of two people who were in the habit of touching each other in small ways. And then she moved toward the elevator, and he fell into step beside her, and they rode up together to get her coat and her bag, and then rode back down and walked out through the revolving doors into an April evening that was genuinely warm for the first time in months. Tessa was already at the school when they arrived, positioned at her display with the authority of a person who has been ready for some time and would like that noted. Her project this semester was on the navigational capacity of sea turtles, how they use the Earth's magnetic field to find their way across thousands of miles of open ocean, returning to the same beaches where they had been born, pulled by something they couldn't see or explain but that directed them with precision anyway. She presented it to them with the focused intensity she brought to everything she cared about, and her teacher stood nearby with the expression teachers wear when a student has genuinely exceeded what was asked. And the gymnasium was full of families and noise and the particular warmth of a room full of people who have shown up for something. Sienna listened to Tessa describe magnetic navigation with complete attention. She asked 2 questions that Tessa received as adequate. Callum stood beside her and asked one question that Tessa received as excellent, which she indicated by the specific tilt of her head. Later, after the showcase, walking back to the car through the mild April dark, Tessa walked between them and talked about the next project she was planning, which involved the deep ocean, specifically the parts where no light reached, and where creatures had adapted to thrive in conditions that seemed, from the outside, impossible for life. "They live down there," Tessa said, "in the dark, and they're fine." "They are," Callum said, "because they adapted." She seemed to find this correct and satisfying. You can adapt to almost anything if you have to. Neither Sienna nor Callum said anything to this. Tessa looked up at both of them with the expression she wore when she suspected that adults were finding significance in something she had not specifically intended to be significant, and she had a particular relationship with this. She neither encouraged it nor entirely dismissed it. She simply looked at them and then looked back at the street ahead. She reached up and took both their hands. They walked the rest of the way to the car like that, the 3 of them, in the quiet of a Brooklyn evening in April. Unhurried, not performing anything, not managing anything, just moving through an ordinary night together. Visible to everyone, hidden from no one, and in no way pretending to be something other than what they were. Which was, in the end, enough, more than enough. It was the whole thing.